Good evening. Welcome to the Bradford County Historical Society. Thank you for coming to our last program of this year. And what we've been doing throughout the years for people that have come to every program this year, we've had a little loyalty card that we have been punching. And so we've had two people that turned in those cards tonight, having them all done. Now, one of them happens to be my parents. And there's one other one. So I don't know what the fair way to do it is, but I guess I'll hold the can and Tom can pull the card. How about that? Congratulations. You can. So the prize is that you can pick something $50 or under in the gift shop, a book or something like that of that value. So there you go. You probably already have everything that I've ever done, so I don't know how that'll work, but good luck. So the museum is closed for a season. Just an announcement or two is closed for the season, but you can still schedule appointments. Tom remains with us, so he can give you a tour if you are interested in that. And we had a giant workshop here this morning with 35 people and chairs and tables, and they left mid-afternoon, so Tom tore it all down, put this all back up, so we could have this tonight. So give him a round of applause. It's been a long day. So we have an interesting program tonight. And first of all, it's been fighting me right down to the last second to get the program, or get the PowerPoint to work. And so now I'm live streaming off from this laptop and doing a PowerPoint presentation at the same time. So something could blow up along the way. I don't know, but hopefully everything goes well. Lots of images to look at here. And I have a few things to read, but most of the time I'll be just talking off the top of my head, so we'll see how it goes this evening. So this story first came to my attention a long time ago. It was an article that I had read, just 2 pages, typewritten by Roger Cagle, formerly of Canton. His mother was Eleanor Cagle, who was quite well known for her newspaper photography back in the 50s and 60s in the Canton area. And she was also well known as a local historian in the Canton area, and collected a lot of information. Her family, the Parsons family, went back to the beginning of Canton. And they also owned land up around Minnequaw Springs and owned one of the original cottages that the Minnequaw Springs guests that had stayed and built cottages had. And right up around the corner is where the Haywood family also owned their cottage. So they knew them quite well. And so her son, Roger Cagle, had written this article about a book called The Whir of Wings. This is the book. It's extremely rare. She only had, Gertrude is who I'm talking about, had 300 of these printed after Ernest Eagles Haywood died to tell his life story. So this book contains a lot of his letters that she wrote, transcribed, but she also wrote her own take on things. And Gertrude is a character, and she kind of talks way up here in the clouds. That's how I explained it, and it's very difficult to read what she has, but nevertheless, that's where we start with this story. I read that article, which led me to eBay to find the book, and found this one, which is signed by Gertrude, which is the only one so far I've seen that she actually signed, which was unusual. So I put that in the library at Leroy Heritage Museum. I later found another one, which I put in the library here. So you're welcome to come in and read it sometime, but if I just warn you, you'll be bored to death. But maybe after hearing the story, you'll be able to connect it better if you do that. So later on, I was interested in writing this story in the Leroy Heritage Museum magazine. So I started looking around for other source information I could find. And just happenstance, I went back on eBay again and typed in Ernest Eagles Haywood, and pops a diary that Ernest Eagles Haywood had written in around 1919 to 1921. And I thought, what are the chances of that? So immediately, I bought it. Got it in the mail. Pretty interesting. I mean, he was a very young man at the time, and just writing about his trips to the theater, girls he met on the street, girls he wanted to date, all sorts of things. Tickets that he kept from plays that he went to and other things like that, and just basically daily life. I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. Filed that away, and that's the last I heard about that for a while. So I got ready to write a story about this, and I wanted to look at the house where I knew that they had lived in Minnequa. The house is up behind Rockgirt Bed and Breakfast, if you know where that is, and it's concealed from the road, so you really have to drive up into the driveway as if you're going to Rockgirt in order to see it back in the trees, so it's concealed from all sides. So I asked Mary Beth Schoonover at Rockgirt, and I said, can you connect me with the family that owns this property so I could possibly get in there and take some pictures of the architecture of the building and all of that kind of thing. So she contacted them. Now, no one was living there at the time. It was owned by the children of the family, and the mother, Phyllis Jones, at that time, had passed away. She had been in a nursing home for several years. So the house had sat unattended, but they had not closed the estate. So they said they had no problem, and so the Schoonovers opened up the house and just said, have at it. And they went back to Rockgirt. So I spent 2-3 hours, I think, by the time it was all done, with cameras and video and mapping and doing floor plans and everything I could possibly find to document the house. And it's a giant house, so this is why it took so long. And after I walked out of there, my next thought was, this is an interesting story. And so I ended up doing more research and writing a story about it, which you'll see. So that's the introduction of how I got into it. The inside of this book looks like this. Published in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's where the Haywood family was from. They were wound up in Minnequa Springs as a result of a scandal that occurred in Raleigh, North Carolina. And that is what Canton people didn't know about, because back in the time that she lived there, the news did not reach Canton, apparently, that whatever happened in Raleigh had happened. So they knew about her, and they knew about what ultimately happened to Eagles, but they didn't know what happened that brought her there in the first place, which is fascinating. I later in this process, in the program, I will talk about the people in Raleigh, North Carolina that I met who were writing a book on what happened before she came to Canton, and they didn't know what had happened in Canton. So it's the research is just about as interesting, to me anyway, as the story itself. That's just her signature there in the book. She's a very scribbly writer, so there's letters that we have of her, but it just takes hours to decipher what she wrote. So this is the diary that I got on eBay, and inside are some pictures there of the tickets and things. He saved every ticket from every performance he went to, plays, orchestras, operas, everything. Some he went to with his mother, some he went to with friends. Some of them were dates, but he saved every little scrap of everything. There's a drawing for a 10-pound turkey there. I mean, he saved it all, so pretty neat. And of course, he also wrote things. Up here These are tickets from a date he had with this girl here, Agnes Kerr, 1920. And then he often goes on to write what his opinion of that particular girl was after the date and whether he plans to contact her or not again. So that's more of his writing. So my visit to Owenheim, I came back with hundreds of pictures taken from walking through that house. So just a little bit of background on what the house looks like, and then some of the pictures that I took when I first visited there. This was what the house originally looked like. It was built by a Mrs. Thomas Owens around the time that the second Minnequaw Springs Hotel was built. And it was quite a large house, and she had also added this stone terrace out here, which must have been an immense amount of money. When you see it, the blocks are huge that they brought in there to build that with, and it's just a small garden terrace is all it is, but she spent lots of money on it. Later on, the Jones family completely transformed the house and turned it into something different. Added stone to the first floor of it and changed colors and so on, but that's the same angle. This picture was taken in the 1990s, early 90s, but that gives you a good idea of how big the house is. So the next several pictures were taken on the day that I first visited there. And the terrace, stones up to the terrace, all that is pictured there. So inside it had beautiful woodwork. It was only supposed to be a summer home, so it was not fitted up with furnaces originally. It had some fireplaces to get some morning heat and that type of thing. But all the floor joists up here are open and stained and varnished, and this was originally the dining room is what we're looking at. That's a view of the ceiling again. And then there was a library next to that, and then a drawing room, and then they called this room the Grand Hall, and this was in the middle of all of those rooms. So to the left was the drawing room, straight forward was the library, and behind the stairway to the right is the dining room, and then you have the stairway here and the front doors right out of the picture to the left. But the purpose of this was when Minnequaw Springs was in existence, the Owen family would have what they called home talent plays, and they would open up all the folding doors you see all through here, and it would open up to one big large room, and people would put on a play in the library part, and then they would have seating in the wings and in the center hall there for Minnequaw guests to come up there and see that. So it was kind of an unusual design. The stairway, the first time I tried to visit here, I peeked in the window and saw that post right there, and I thought, wow, that's something. But hand-carved, circular, I don't know what it is, but it's amazing. So upstairs, this was, I guess you would call the master bedroom, and this would be Gertrude Haywood's bedroom when she lived there. It had a fireplace in it. And the ceiling is all pieced together in all of these hand-done pieces of wood. I can't imagine hand-nailing all of those over top of my head, but that's how they did that. And this is Ernest Eagles Haywood's bedroom. They did some renovations, so the one corner is not quite the same, but he had a fireplace too. And I threw this in because this was the servants' quarters in the back of the house. The house is so big, they had a servants that ran it when Mrs. Owen was there. So there are about 4 bedrooms for servants over top of the kitchen and the butler's pantry and a back staircase and all of that, separate from the main part of the house. So there's several more bedrooms in the main part. This was just the servants' quarters. So then I went to the attic. And the attic was empty except for a few things, but it was awfully dark. and had one light bulb above the stairway, but this house, as you can see, was so big that this attic just kept on going. And all I had with me was my cell phone light, trying to see what went on, and a camera with a flash, which seemed to work to just start flashing in every direction so I could see what was there. Fortunately, no one was standing there when I did that. But when I got up there, it didn't look like it was too exciting, and when I looked toward the back of the attic, there was this large, strange-shaped chimney there, and in the dark, it just looked like that's the end of the attic. But when I was snapping these pictures, and I went back and looked at the pictures, I found that there's room to walk around to the back side. So what I found was a water cistern back there that they provided water by gravity to the house, and then beyond that, a door in a wall. And I thought, this is interesting. No one told me about this. And so when I went in there, it opened to this room, clear in the back of the attic. All of a sudden, a finished room after you walk through the unfinished attic. And a lot of things tacked to the walls. And then one window in the back. You could see how there had been a little dormer window there sometime in the last 10, 15 years, someone had put a new window in, so someone had been in there, but still lots of things on the walls. A little desk back here, some shelves on the walls. Over here out of the view were several different smoking pipes stuck down in little loops that were tacked to the wall. And so I started looking at the things on the wall, and I actually had a video I took when I walked in there, and it's too embarrassing to show here, so I will not show it, because I was too excited at this whole thing. It seemed like the greatest thing I'd ever found, so my reaction is too embarrassing to show. But I have pictures to show. First of all, that little dormer window, you can see right there, when it was there, it had been taken out later on. So there was a room there, and supposedly when the Owen family lived there, that was quarters for their driver, for their horse and, surrey, whatever they had. That there was an outdoor stairway up to that, and supposedly he lived up there. I don't know if I believe that or not. That's what I've been told. I don't know. In the summertime, it would have been excruciatingly hot up there. I don't know. Maybe that's where he lived. I don't know. But so there was that little window, and so that desk would have been sitting next to that little window when that was there. And a close-up of that desk. The family was donating things to the Leroy Heritage Museum at that time. We ended up moving 4 truckloads of local history material out of that house. And when we were toward the end, I said, could I have that desk up there in the attic? And they go, you want that desk? What do you want that for? I said, well, I think it might be connected to the Haywoods. I don't really know, but you're not going to do anything with it, are you? Nope. So we hauled it down the winding attic stairs. That's what it looked like when we got it back there. So it was pretty dirty. And now it's in the Leroy Heritage Museum, cleaned up, though. So on the walls in this room, lots of things were tacked to the wall. And I first found these things that had Ernest Eagles Haywood's name typed on them. And everything on the wall was from the 1920s. So I was pretty excited. So here is a driver's license of his. What was that? Violation of the automobile law. He was pretty proud of it, so he tacked it to the wall. This is like a kid's treehouse is what this reminds me of. Hunting and fishing license, and this little box of empty cartridges for a gun that he had. Dog license for a dog. He once had a pedigree there for a dog that he had. A map of the Pine Bluff Improvement and Development Company in Pine Bluff, North Carolina, which is where the Haywoods stayed during the winter months. And he had lots of pictures of actresses all over the wall. These are the ones that I can show in a family program. But there were a lot of other ones too. He saved lots of pictures. He cut pictures out of magazines. He had some autographed pictures. I don't know where they came from. And other pictures of Wild West cowboys and things that a young guy, I guess, high school age, young adult age would have on the wall, I guess. So on that desk was this little framed piece here where he took time and cut out little actresses and things and glued them on there and made this little craft project. These were hand-drawn sketches with pencil of girls again. Some of them sent to him by his friends down in North Carolina. Maybe others were done by him, I'm not sure. And he had a particular fascination with foreign countries and with maps. And so there were these flags of foreign countries tacked all over the wall, and an atlas that was ripped apart from being up in that room for years was sitting on the desk still. And why were all these things still there? Because Mrs. Haywood in the 1950s still owned the house. She sold it to a Franciscan monk group who used it as a summer retreat, and that's it. And the rest of the year the house sat. They probably had no reason to go into the attic, and if they did, they probably didn't notice the room in the back. I don't know. After they used it for a while, it got sold to the Jones family, who was the family that was still there when I got there. And the Jones family, I asked the adult kids that are now retired kids, do you remember this room and do you remember this desk being up there? And they said, yep, when we were kids and first came here as a vacation home, that was there and it's never been moved. So I said, I'm pretty sure that desk is from the Haywoods. So we'll return to that topic later. So as they were cleaning out the house, down in the library, they said, go through the books. These are some of the books that were on shelves. This had been a library when the Haywoods were there. And there were some things left from the Haywoods that were still there and other things from their family. So they told me to go through and pick out what books that I wanted. And I went through and found some. And as I got around to the other corner of the room, there was a box on the shelf that looked like a money box of sorts. But it was packed in with things all around it on the shelf, so I didn't notice it at first. And when I pulled it off the shelf, it had Mrs. Gertrude Tucker on the side, Raleigh, North Carolina. So Gertrude Haywood originally was Gertrude Tucker. Her first husband died, and so this was apparently her box at one time. So pretty excited, I pulled that off the shelf, and inside it was filled with letters all written to Ernest Eagles Haywood. And he kept a meticulous index of all the letters he saved. And there were business letters in there. There were letters from girls who wanted to marry him. There were letters from family. Just you name it. It was packed right to the top. And I couldn't believe it. And so they donated that, of course. I wasn't going to leave without it. So it was pretty exciting. So some examples are, this is a letter written by Gertrude to her son Eagles. She always begins her letters with, my precious boy. And then the rest of it you got to spend hours to figure out because it's interesting. But most of the letters from what we've been able to read are all saying, I miss you, please come home. I shouldn't have let you go away. And, you know, it's kind of interesting. And at the top of this particular letter, it's got a name for the house. It originally was called Owenheim, and she called it Halua. I think that's the pronunciation, if I'm getting that right. Later, or maybe before that, I'm not sure, at some point it was also called Eagle's Nest because Ernest Eagles Haywood was grown up in that house, and that was his nest. This is another example of her handwriting, so it never improves. It's always the same. This is an example of a girl who desperately wanted to marry Eagles. She was from Canton, and she had written to him apparently, and so she's asking him if he would please reply to the question that she had previously asked him, and it's sealed with a kiss down here too. So this is an interesting letter. First of all, his nickname was Buster. His family knew him as Buster. But in this letter, he mentions, or this girl, I guess, is writing to him, mentions Ernest Haywood, who is supposedly his father, which we'll address later. and that he happened to be in the office where this girl was working, which seems very unusual. Don't know the background, but she's writing and mentioning him, which you'll understand why that's important later on. But that was kind of an interesting find in the box. That's the next part of it. One picture in the box of this girl, I don't know which one she is, but one of the ones that was writing to him, and she's from Titusville, so there were some letters addressed Titusville. I can't remember what her name was, but I'm assuming that's who that is. And then in the library were several magazines left over when he was a boy and had his name scrawled on them and the date. He was a member of the Boy Scouts for a while. He received Boy Scout magazines. So he's writing on their name of the house again. This book had Gertrude's original married name, which is very unusual because she wasn't Winder is her name. Gertrude Winder, she wasn't that when she first came to the area, so she had brought that with her. And then that's another magazine addressed to her as Gertrude Winder. So lots of things were found in the house. So some family background on this, because after I went all through that, I was overwhelmed by all this. I want to know why in the world there's a room in the attic that has all this stuff still in it. And by the way, all that stuff later got donated to the museum, and I carefully took the tacks out, which were little square tacks that were hammered in. So that's all at Leroy Heritage Museum now. So some background on the family. First of all, Gertrude's grandfather is this man, John Henry Winder. He was first cousin 3 times removed of U.S. President James Polk, which is interesting. But during the Civil War, he was a Confederate general, and he ended up being the general who had control of all the Confederate prisons east of the Mississippi River. So this is the grandfather of this girl. This is her father and mother. Her father, John Cox Winder, was also a Confederate major in the war, and that's her mother, Octavia Marie Winder. And the interesting thing is they reused these names over and over in the women in the family, and it annoys me to no end because you have to stop and think about which one that is, and so I try to keep it straight. So this is Gertrude as a young child. I'll explain later where all these photos came from. I didn't find them in the house. But Gertrude Winder was born in 1871 in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in Raleigh. And she married William R. Tucker, and he was from a wealthy, well-to-do family as well. William Tucker, his father was part of the largest dry goods firm in the South and in North Carolina, and they had business establishments all over the South and business connections. So especially, I think, prior to the Civil War, they did big business down in the South. And William and Gertrude had 3 children, Rufus, Marie, and Gertrude. So there you go, same Gertrude again. This, however, is the Gertrude we're talking about in the picture, and that is her son Rufus, the oldest son that she had by her first husband. So then we have Ernest Haywood. This is not Ernest Eagles Haywood. This is Ernest Haywood, a different person. Ernest Haywood was born in 1860, also in Raleigh, and he was an attorney, admitted to the bar in 1882. And when the dry goods business of William Tucker closed down in 1897, Ernest Haywood was one of the people who stepped in as an attorney to help do the final affairs and close the business down. So he had a connection with the family already. So when her husband, William Tucker, died, being that she knew him, she hired Ernest Haywood to be her attorney to settle the estate of William Tucker. And in the process of doing that, as the story goes, the two of them fell in love. And there's an age difference of maybe 10 or 12 years, I think, if I'm correct. Supposedly, they were married. I say supposedly because he later claimed they never got married. She claimed they did get married. But they had been seen together in Raleigh. They had been seen together in other towns. And so people suspected something was going on, but this guy was kind of shy and he didn't talk about what was happening there. And the problem became a scandal when she turned out to be pregnant. So whether she's married or not married is a big deal in early 1900s. Well, in order to escape scrutiny, Gertrude had to leave Raleigh, North Carolina, because people were talking like crazy. So she had to get out of there and went north. Supposedly, he was with her at the time. If you read this book, she says he was with her. So we had this develop. Is he the father or is he not the father? So a little rift developed between the Haywoods and the Winders, and they were arguing kind of civilly back and forth about this, and things just continued to go downhill in this argument. And one day on the street in Raleigh in front of the post office, this is what it looked like at the time, the Ernest Haywood was walking on the street, and he was walking past the post office, and he met up with Ludlow Skinner, is his name. And that's a picture of Ludlow Skinner on the right. And they met in front of the post office just by happen chance and had a conversation that seemed to turn into an argument. This had not been the first time that they had argued. They had met and tried to chat this out before and never came to a conclusion. Some of the children of Gertrude had once been walking on the street and encountered Ernest Haywood and asked him if he would pay for new shoes for them. And supposedly he pulled out $5 and gave it to them, at which time their aunt, finding this out, took the $5, gave it back to him, and said he was never to have anything to do with their family again. So this is all background leading up to this little visit. And so on February 21st, 1903, at 4:30 p.m., these two meet in front of the Raleigh post office, and there's 100 witnesses on the street. And Ernest Haywood, there's many versions of the story according to the newspaper, but Ernest Haywood pulled out a pistol and shot Ludlow Skinner in the stomach. And Ludlow Skinner turned around, kind of running away, and he shot him again in the back, fell to the ground, and died. Again, 100 people witnessed it happen. Mr. Haywood's an attorney, so he turns around. The sheriff comes running up. He turns himself in, goes back to the office, whatever, and this whole thing ultimately goes to trial. And this interesting photo here shows, it's got to be an early x-ray, showing the bullet in Ludlow Skinner. So this goes to trial. The trial was in October 1903. The prosecution examined 50 witnesses. The defense examined over 200 witnesses. The jury was out 15 minutes and came back and said, not guilty. 100 witnesses saw it. The jury said not guilty. The newspapers and everyone else were outraged by that. So we had headlines like this: another slayer is free. So obviously it was well thought that he had been the murderer. But because he was wealthy and he was high-class citizen of Raleigh, maybe he got away with it. That's kind of what they're, I think, insinuating here. So, moving on from that interesting development, we have Ernest Eagles Haywood. Gertrude is still pregnant. And prior to this murder, he had been up north with her, as she writes in her book, and she gave birth to a child in Nova Scotia named Ernest Eagles Haywood. So in the meantime, she needed a place to live. She couldn't go back to Raleigh, especially after this murder. And so her mother bought property for her in Minnequa, Bradford County, Pennsylvania. And that deed on the top is the one where they bought it from Mrs. Owen's estate. She had died. And a few years later, it was transferred to Gertrude, so Gertrude owned it herself. But originally, her mother bought it, and Gertrude moved into that house at Minnequa with this newborn baby. So this is the first picture of Ernest Eagles Haywood that was taken as a baby. And he was born September 2nd, 1902 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And so she went a long way away from Raleigh to have this child. But in the book, Gertrude wrote that Ernest Haywood was with her when the child was born. So later on, he said he had nothing to do with this. So this makes this a quandary, I guess. So a few things I will read from the book that are interesting. I can't read much because it will bore you to death, but her interesting outlook on this, I think, helps with the story. So she wrote, "The Eastertide before he came to earth, he was born in September. I rose Easter morning and went to the early celebration of the Holy Communion in the little chapel at Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, where we were spending the Easter holidays. As I knelt before the altar, I dedicated my unborn child to the service of Christ, lifting my eyes, obedient to a habit formed in my childhood, believing that the first object upon which my sight fell would be token the fulfillment or denial of my prayer. If an object of beauty, my prayer had been found favor with God. If something unlovely, then the reverse. I saw above the gleaming lilies on the altar other lilies of transcendent radiance and unearthly beauty, and I gave thanks to my Lord that he had heard this prayer for my child. I was very frail at this time, and my physician, Dr. John H. Musser of Philadelphia, had told Mr. Haywood that I must go to some bracing northern climate for the great experience before me. So we went to Raquette Lake in the Adirondacks, intending to remain there until after the advent of the little stranger." I just roll my eyes, but this is how she writes. "I had with me my two little daughters and their dear old colored mammy. Rufus, my eldest child, was at camp in the White Mountains. The climate here proved unfriendly. Being directly on the lake, I found it damp and consequently enervating. After a short time there, I was stricken with pleuropneumonia and was very ill. As soon as I was able to travel, Mr. Haywood, obeying Dr. Musser's orders, took me further north to a drier and even more stimulating climate. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, we found a quaint little house opening in the rear upon a walled garden where bloomed in profusion every variety, it seemed, of old-fashioned flowers. Lovely roses, unrestrained in their, I'm not going to pronounce that, in beauty, clambered over the wall and trailed along the soil at one's feet. At one end of the garden was a wide spreading tree under whose friendly boughs my chaise lounge was placed, and a table for my books and writing material. In this enchanting spot, I passed my days as safe as guarded by a charm against the stab of worldlings. Many hours were spent playing with the children, reading, writing, and most of all, communing with the mysterious being who lay beneath my heart, whose personality was as real to me then as in the blessed 25 years that followed when we walked this earth path together. This was the setting that he found when he came. I shall never forget the first glimpse of his face. Drifting back from dreamland, I was greeted by these words from Mr. Haywood as he bent over me. 'It is a little boy, and he looks like Beethoven.' I gazed upon my son and could but smile at the comical suggestion of that great master in his tiny face, with its serious, almost stern expression, and his wonderful eyes loaded with fate. I knew then, as I have never doubted since, and as I now, in my utter human anguish and desolation, know most of all, that this soul who sought the humble channel of my body to come to earth came to teach me the significance of this earth life in the cosmic scheme and to point the way to my ultimate freedom. So, anyone want to read that book? I make jokes out of it because it's a very sad story, and that's how we have to cope with this. So that's where we are. So I think that it was interesting that at the bottom there, we found his baby book, and Gertrude wrote in there that his first words were "Papa." So it's interesting that that Ernest Haywood claims he wasn't there. He's not the father, but the first words of the child were "Papa." Interesting to me. So Ernest grows up. So here's another early picture of him. I believe that's Gertrude holding Eagles, oftentimes dressed up like a little girl, so it's hard to tell. Eagles with 2 cats on his lap. So this is a picture of him at Minnequaw. And we have some more quotes from her. At 4 years of age, the joy of having Eagles constantly with me day and night was realized. Up to that time, I had to yield the care of him to my dear trained nurse and godmother, Miss Georgia Perry of Savannah and Boston. There was never one moment of boredom in the time we spent together, whether romping with him, reading to him, or telling him stories, the eerie things he loved of fairies, gnomes, and elves, of Peter Pan, Robin Hood, or adventures in the deep forest. Life was ecstatic to us both. Eagles accompanied me to metaphysical lectures when he was only 6 years old, and would sit on a hassock at my knee listening as absorbedly as any student of the occult. I recall a lecture at the house of a friend in New York in which I took him. When I arrived with my starry-eyed boy, my friend was aghast at the thought of taking a little child into the drawing room where the noted Hindu was to discourse on phases of the Vedanta philosophy, and begged me to let Eagles play in the garden in the care of her trusted English maid. I assured her that my little son would annoy no one, and with trepidation she saw us take our seats. Not once did he move or take his eyes from the Swami's face. I heard afterwards that some of those present pitied the little boy, thinking that only severe discipline could have achieved such results. So still and calm he was, under an apparent strain. Eagles was never disciplined. Loving words and tender caresses, happiness and sunshine made the sum of his existence. He was at no time guilty of anything that required discipline. So these are his 2 stepsisters, Marie and Gertrude, and the only pictures, I think, of them that I've seen. So that's a pretty interesting picture. And this is him with his horse. She writes that Eagles had a horse and had the most amazing control over him. He would call the Shetland to him when he would be on the veranda with me, and the little animal would stalk up the steps, that's the little stone veranda we showed earlier, and across to us with almost human recognition, rubbing his head against Eagle's shoulder and following him like a dog everywhere. Eagles had a brooding and protecting love for everything living. Even snakes were friendly to him, and he caught and played with all the specimens that he could find in the woods and fields of Minnequaw. So that was taken right outside where one of those earlier pictures I took of the house when I visited. This was taken right off the porch in the same place. She wrote, "I did not permit him to play indiscriminately with children, so eager was I to maintain inviolate the purity of his mind. Up to that time, he was 12 years of age. At 12 years of age, he had only had 2 playmates. George McGehee Jr., the son of my beloved friend, and the other Lansing Zabriskie of New York. So he only played with 2 other children up to age 12. And as we'll see next, he did not go to school until age 9 because she held him out of school for this same reason. She thought he was a prodigy, as she writes in her book. She wrote, Eagle's education was begun at Minnequaw in his 9th year by Miss Margaret Innes, a loving, tender comradeship, gently guiding him along the perilous path of the 3 R's. In the winter, he continued with Miss Harriet McNeil, who had the little village school in Pine Bluff, North Carolina, where he spent our winters. I can see him now trudging on to school with his little strap of books. Before he left me, after innumerable kisses, he would question, "Will you be here when I come back?" We would repeat this many, many times, and when I assured him that I would, and I always was, he would look at me and say, "Now be sure. Now be sure." The older children teased him because of this habit and would often cause his dear eyes to fill with tears. I would stand at the window to watch him go up the path schoolward. Always, he would turn every 2 or 3 steps and kiss his little hand to me, keeping this up until he was out of sight. So, skipping ahead in his life, in October 1919, again, this is him standing outside of the house at Minnequaw, grown up a little. He entered Brown-Nichols Day School in Cambridge, Massachusetts to prepare for Harvard University, or at least that's what Gertrude thought was going to happen. His teacher wrote in a letter to Gertrude, "Mrs. Haywood, your son presents a unique and difficult problem, one I have met but once before in my long experience as a teacher. Boys such as Eagles are rarely gifted and know infinitely more than most boys of their age in literature, philosophy, and general awareness of life and events, but nothing that the average boy knows in the regular school curriculum." As it turns out, he hated school, much to the chagrin of his mother. So in the summer of 1921, he finished his schooling at the Brown-Nichols School, but he informed his mother then that he was not going on to Harvard. And so she talked him into taking some classes with a tutor to at least get a little education, which he consented to do, but he hated it so much that his health started to deteriorate. And so she ended up bringing him back home to live at Minnequaw for a while. And that is around the time that all those things were tacked on the wall in that room in the attic at Minnequaw. So he spent time up there, and this would be the last time he would be at Minnequaw. And I kind of think this room was his way to get away from his mother and have a little place up there. He liked to write. That was one thing he liked to do. He was trying to be a writer, but he wouldn't go to school to learn about it, so he wanted to just write on his own, and so he would spend a lot of time up there, I think, at that desk, which had a writing pad on it, still all these years later, and he would write there, and he would write letters to friends, and he would keep his books on the shelves that were on the wall, and you could tell that there were other things on the walls originally that someone had pulled off years ago. So it probably was set up like his little personal den, I guess. So Rufus Tucker, his brother, the one that was the baby in the earlier picture, sent a letter in 1922 to Eagles and was disappointed that Eagles had decided not to go to college and asked him to reconsider, and that if he needs financial help, he would be glad to do that. And Eagles did not take his advice. So Eagles decided instead to try to get some work on his own, but he hated every job that he tried to get. And so in the process of that, one day in his being so upset, I guess, he became intoxicated for the first time in his life. and he appeared in front of his mother intoxicated. Well, this strange relationship between the two of them, this completely overwhelmed him that he had done such a thing in front of his mother. And so he left and ran off for 2 months and did not come home. She didn't know where he went. He sent a letter while he was away, and in 1924, "Most precious mother, I cannot stand the disgrace. I am going to make something out of myself. Trust me once more and believe this. I will write to you soon. Be brave as I shall have to be. God watches above us. I love you more than my life. Do not look for me, for I swear that I will kill myself before I return in disgrace. Love me as I shall always love and worship you. Most devotedly, Buster." She writes in her book about this particular time in his life that a dark and sinister shadow was gathering. Eagles returned home after 2 months of wandering, continued to try to do some work, took on some things, just hated it. He had one job working for a lumber company out in a lumber yard that he absolutely loved, but he did that job so well that when he got a promotion to be a salesperson, he hated that job and ended up quitting. So he ultimately moved to Long Island, where he finally got a job as a magazine writer. Don't know what magazine it was. And that is where we find him on May 28th, 1928, when he placed 2 pieces of paper in his typewriter with a piece of carbon paper between them and typed what would be his final piece, which is a letter to his mother. And this is the letter. "Beloved mother, and you are truly beloved by me, and now you must prove your great love for me by being strong, brave, clean, and having faith. You must help me in and on my great adventure by being and having these things. Mother, I have overcome the body. It is already dead. I have but to liberate the spirit, and the time is set for early Wednesday morning. Know, my mother, that I am not at all afraid, and you must not be. I will tell you many things in time from the unknown, yet known, if you will be brave and wait. You are not ready to go or know as yet. Remember, I shall always love you. At first, I will come to you in many ways, and then in time you will know me, and I will tell you of my going and of that to come. Only a few hours now," this is now 7:45 on May 29th, "only a few hours now, and I will be able to visit you. Oh, my precious mother, be brave and strong, as you should wish me to be had you gone on first. I am not afraid, and I am wholly ready, even impatient, but I cannot go until after midnight. You must always know and feel my love for and near you, for it will always be so. Try and remember the things that I have told you, for they are true and may help you. Above all, have faith in that which you know is, and overcome by and through love. That may be the hardest way. It was my way. But it is the surest. It will only hurt me to feel that my loved ones are not happy, for already I have utter and lasting joy that waits for the spirit after it leaves this body house. I cannot tell you in human words. Precious mother, I am able to already know many things about you, and this is one, that once you were on the right path, but now are not. Be strong, and I will be able to help you because of my path. I can only reach you if you are gentle, loving, gay, and understanding with your fellow man. Above all, be strong and brave. If you should go on now, I might lose track of you, and there would be the agony of our searching for each other. When the time comes for you to go, I will be with you. Do not allow the girls, Rufus, or any of my friends to feel for their happiness, will mean much to me. Poor Marie was with me when I suffered the agony of the outgoing animal man. I am perfectly calm sitting here, this is 10:10 p.m., thinking of all my loved ones and praying that you all may have peace as well as strength, real happiness, and health. Sometime I will be able to tell you that what it is like to be in a body house that is already senseless. 12:05 a.m. May 30th. Before long, I will be with you. This body house will be empty before this letter starts at 7 a.m. May God keep you in his loving care, precious mother. And 4 a.m., most precious mother, it is time to go. Peace be with you. I love you, your son. And the next morning, he was found dead. A woman that he was scheduled to go on a date with showed up at his apartment, received no answer at the door, went inside, and found that he had shot himself in the head after he mailed these 2 letters. So 1 letter was mailed to his mother, and 1 letter was mailed to his sister, Marie. The letter that I showed you on the screen was the original letter that was found in Raleigh, North Carolina, along with all these pictures from a descendant of the family who still lives there, and these things had been passed down to her along with the baby book that I mentioned. The second letter was passed down through Marie's family, and earlier in August, a descendant of her had the carbon copy letter and made a trip from New Hampshire to Leroy, Pennsylvania with that letter and donated it to the museum. So on here is the original carbon copy that he put in his typewriter that night. 2 pages. So he was buried in a family grave plot where his mother is also buried. And this is his grave marker. It says, "We have but to hold the torch of truth and beauty to the world, and from everything in the world the same light comes back to us." So, in 2017, after visiting that house, I wrote this magazine for Leroy Heritage Museum with the story that we just talked about and some pictures of the house and so on. So it was published in the fall of 2017, and those digital versions of those go on the website later where people can buy and download digital copies of those. So when people Google, this comes up. And that's the last I heard about it until 2021, August 12th, when I got a message from Olivia Hand from the Oakwood Cemetery, who was an intern there at the time, followed up quickly by Robin Simonton, who's the executive director there, both of them asking about the diary that we had, as was mentioned in this magazine. They had purchased and downloaded this issue and read this story. And the reason they were looking for this information to start with is they had been writing a book about the murder and the trial that occurred in Raleigh, North Carolina for many years. And in the process of researching, this book, by the way, was written by Robin Simonton and Bruce Miller. Bruce is the historian at the cemetery. This is a large cemetery. And Robin is the executive director. And they were looking for information on occasion, and they had noticed on a Google search that this diary of Ernest Eagles Haywood had been sold to someone. And they thought to themselves, who in the world would buy this diary from this kid that no one knows about? So they didn't know any more about it, who got it. They were like, doing investigations to try to figure this out. And eventually, after the magazine from Leroy was online for a while, it came up in the Google search, and they found that, came to the Leroy website, bought that issue, read it, and saw scans of the diary and said, that's where it went. And that's why I got some excited emails from them looking for this information and wanting to connect. So we ended up emailing back and forth a few times and then set up a Zoom meeting where we had a long conversation between Rob and Bruce and myself on there and kind of got up to date. Well, they didn't know much about her Canton connection here, so they had learned a lot by reading the magazine. I had no idea before the magazine that murder had happened down there. So we caught up on this whole story and how this all came together and kind of marveled at the fact that we, made this interesting connection there. So we shared material. I scanned all the letters and gave the scans to them so that they could print them out and use that for research. They came in contact, as I mentioned, with a family member down in Raleigh that had the baby book, the photos, the other suicide note, and they met with her, scanned all that material, shared it with me, and we were pretty excited about that. And so with that extra detail, they ended up publishing their book in 2022 called Life and Death in High Places, which focuses on the murder and the trial, which was a lot longer and more in-depth than what I explained here tonight. And a little promo, you can go to LeroyHeritage.org and order the book from us. And also the magazine I wrote, too, is also for sale on there as a download. So their book came out. This was noticed by the North Carolina State Bar Journal, and ultimately a story was printed in their journal, which is a very prestigious thing to have happen, in spring of 2022. They have carried on this story down there in Raleigh at their cemetery, giving tours of many of the people in this story are buried in the Oakwood Cemetery. So they've given tours after this book came out of the graves of these people. Interestingly, the shooter and the shootee are buried not far from each other in the cemetery. This is Bruce Miller, and that's Robin Simonton, who I mentioned. This is another thing they've done with that book, and that is to have a trolley tour of places mentioned in the story in Raleigh, North Carolina. And most recently, they had a theater experience created out of this book and presented that. So they've done some interesting things there. As for up here at Leroy Heritage Museum, there's the desk, which is on display. By the way, that desk is interesting because it was just made out of scraps laying around the attic, is my interpretation. The legs were all broken off. It was an actual table at one time, but they were not cut off, they were broken off. And pieces of tongue and groove wood left over from the house that were stored in the attic were used to make new legs of a different height so it would fit him better. And so it's just tacked together like it's, again, treehouse furniture. So I cleaned up the desk. The box that had the letters is in there. The letters are in our archives there. And this past year, I did a new exhibit panel to go with it that tells this entire story in short form with a lot of the photos that you saw here tonight so people can understand the story. Obviously, it is a long story to try to tell in a museum exhibit, but we do our best. And that's the end. It's a long and complicated story, but the way we've made connections and found information is just fascinating to me. But Sue, did you have some first? He was the husband of Gertrude's sister, and he was upset because Gertrude's sister had been very upset, and he was ready to put an end to this situation, and he had confronted him several times as a result of that. No. Some accounts say that he had reached behind into his coat for something, and that is why Haywood used that as self-defense, that he thought something was going to happen. It might say more in the book, but it's interesting how it came together. Yeah.
I wasn't sure if I understood that. Did you become interested in Gertrude's family and the house before you knew about the murder?
Yeah. What I neglected to say about that is when I started to research more about the story, I went on newspapers.com and typed in Ernest Eagles Haywood, and I kept getting articles about an Ernest Haywood and a murder in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I said, well, that's just a coincidence, another Ernest Haywood. Must be a lot of Haywoods down there. So that can't have anything to do with this. So I ignored it for a while. And then finally something came together, and I said, wait a minute, there's a connection with this, and went back and looked and figured that part out before I came in contact with those people down there. So thanks to technology, I guess, is the only way. But that's why people in Canton had no idea that this had ever happened, because it was never in any local paper. I couldn't find it mentioned in any paper in this region when it took place, and yet they call it the biggest criminal trial in North Carolina history, you know, the kind of on the level of the O.J. Simpson trial. So it's pretty amazing that no one up here seemed to know anything about it. But talking to the family member from New Hampshire that I met a little while ago, her statement was that the family has tried to keep that story quiet over the years, and even right down to her mother. Someone had contacted them a while ago, several years ago, I think, wanting to write a book on this topic, and her mother would not talk about it. And so here we are some years later, and she was Googling on the internet one day and found this story at Leroy Heritage Museum. And she said to herself, oh, the story's out there now, I guess. And so I think that's what kind of urged her to get in contact with us and ultimately bring that letter down to us. So she was okay with it. So, yes.
So is he buried in North Carolina or here?
He's buried in North Carolina. Yep. Not buried in the Oakwood Cemetery where all those others are. It's a smaller cemetery, I think, at Pine Bluff area where they had their house. And she's buried there as well. He was in his apartment in Long Island. You know, some of the newspapers apparently have reported that he was in Brooklyn, and that's not correct. He was in Long Island. Yep. She was a great maybe granddaughter of Marie, his stepsister. So it was passed directly down through the family to her. And I'm not sure on the other side, but it was passed down to the person in North Carolina too on the other side. I don't know what the connection there was exactly, but interesting that they found that person down there before I got in contact with the person in New Hampshire. And just the things that came out of that visit that they had down there just blew us away, because that's where we found out the Nova Scotia is where he was born, the exact date, things that he writes about that when she was a baby. She wrote a lot in there. Of course, it's hard to read. And then lots of pictures of all these people, including the bullet in Ludlow Skinner. Yeah. That's what makes this difficult. I don't know. I think maybe she probably did. Supposedly, she often had seances in the house at Minnequaw, so I think that was kind of where she was at with that. But he certainly felt that he was going to make contact with her if you didn't get that out of his letter, and that once he shot himself, that was what was going to happen next. So, interesting. Yeah. I didn't know, But I've heard that before, and her too. Yeah. What's interesting to me is she had 3 children by the first husband, and all of them seemed to grow up very successful and not have problems like this. But when this happened with Ernest Haywood, something, in my opinion, went haywire in her head, and her behavior changed a little bit. So I don't know. It's hard to say because no one sought that kind of treatment, I guess, at the time. So, but it makes you certainly wonder what was going on there. Yep. Yeah, Tuckers. They all remained in contact, and in fact, long after this happened with Eagles dying, the children continued to come visit her at Minnequa. She owned the house until the 1950s. So we had a board member at Leroy Heritage Museum that was 93 or something when she died in 2020, and she used to tell us she remembered Gertrude Haywood walking on the street in Canton going about her business when she was a girl. So she was known, and the kids came to town, and you can read in the newspapers for Canton that her kids were in the area visiting and so on. So this went on, but no one talked about the yeah. Yep, no one talked about it after that. All right. Thank you very much. See you next year. Thank you.